Matthew Hancock.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I'd like to make a statement on our action against coronavirus and the decisions we've been taking through the day today to determine the future of the action needed in Leicester. We continue our determined fight against this invisible killer. The number of new cases yesterday was 642, lower than when lockdown began. And according to the latest figures, the number of deaths in all settings is down to 66. We are successfully turning the tide. And part of this success lies in our ability to take action locally whenever we see it flare up. Often, this is on a very small scale, swiftly and quietly, like in an individual farm or factory. But when needed, we also act on a broader basis, as we've done in Leicester. And today I wanted to update the House on the situation in Leicester. At the end of June, we made the decision to close schools and non-essential retail in the city, and not to introduce the relaxations that applied elsewhere from the 4th of July, like the reopening of pubs. This was not an easy decision, but it was one that we had to take. At that point, the 7-day infection rate in Leicester was 135 cases per 100,000 people, which was 3 times higher than the next highest city. And Leicester was accounting for 10% of all positive cases in the country. This decision was taken with the agreement of all local leaders, and I'm grateful to the leader and officers of Leicestershire County Council and to the officers of Leicester City Council for their support and continued hard work. Since then, we've doubled testing in the city, and through a monumental programme of communications and community engagement, we've been pushing our important messages. I committed to reviewing the measures in Leicester every 2 weeks. This morning I chaired a gold meeting of the Local Action Committee to discuss the latest situation. And this afternoon, I held a further meeting with local leaders, Public Health England, the JBC, the Local Resilience Forum, and my clinical advisors. The latest data show that the 7-day infection rate in Leicester is now 119 cases per 100,000 people, and that the percentage of people who have tested positive is now at 4.8%. These are positive indicators, especially in light of the huge increase in testing in the local area. But they still remain well above the national average and the average for surrounding areas. Thanks to the incredible efforts of people in Leicester, who followed the lockdown, even whilst others across the country have had their freedoms relaxed, we're now in a position to relax some, but not all, of the restrictions that were in place. So, from the 24th of July, we'll be removing the restrictions on schools and early years childcare and taking a more targeted approach to the restrictions on non-essential retail, replacing the national decision to close non-essential retail with a local power to close them where necessary. This is all part of our more targeted approach. However, other restrictions, like those for travel and only having social gatherings of up to 6 people, for example, will remain in force. And measures introduced on the 4th of July, like reopening the hospitality sector, will also not yet apply. The initial definition of the geography covered by the lockdown was a decision I delegated to Leicestershire County Council, and they made and published. The leader of Leicestershire County Council, Nicholas Rushton, has advised me, based on the data and the best public health advice, that he recommends these restrictions now apply only to the Oadby and Wigston area of Leicestershire, as well as the city of Leicester itself, and I've accepted his advice. Some say that the local lockdown is unnecessary. I wish this were true, but sadly it remains vital for the health of everyone in Leicester and the rest of the country that these restrictions stay in place. We will review them again in a fortnight. I hope that this careful easing of restrictions will provide some comfort to people in Leicester and Leicestershire. And I'd say this directly to people of Leicester and of Leicestershire. I pay tribute to you all. Your perseverance and your hard work has brought real and tangible results. And you've shown respect for one another. I understand this hasn't been easy. Strong representations have been made to me by my honourable friends, the members for Charnwood, Harborough and South Leicestershire, and for the members opposite who represent the City of Leicester. On behalf of constituents who've been impacted, the constituents who wanted to see the lockdown lifted too, however, there is still a lot to do, and the public health messages remain critical. So please, get a test if you have symptoms. Keep following the rules that are in place. Please, do not lose your resolve, because the sooner we get this virus under control, the sooner we can restore life in Leicester and across the country to normal. Mr. Speaker, this statement also gives me the opportunity to inform the House of an issue relating to testing. We've identified some swabs that are not up to the usual high standard that we expect, and we'll be carrying out further testing of this batch. As a precautionary measure, and while we investigate further, we're requesting that the use of these Randox swab test kits are paused in all settings until further notice. This problem was brought to my attention yesterday afternoon. We contacted settings using these swabs last night and published the pause notice immediately. Clinical advice is that there is no evidence of any harm, that test results are not affected, there is no evidence of issues with any of our other test swabs, and there is no impact on access to testing. Mr. Speaker, our ability to take action on this local level in Leicester is the keystone of our plan to defeat the coronavirus, so we can keep this virus on the run and defeat it once and for all. I'm grateful to you for allowing me to make a statement at this time, and I commend the statement to the House.
Shadow Secretary of State Jonathan Ashworth to reply.
Mr. Speaker, just before turning to Leicester, could the Secretary of State perhaps update the House and comment on Sir Patrick Vance's remarks at SAGE, who advised today, or said SAGE, I beg your pardon, who at the Select Committee advised that SAGE had advised the government to implement lockdown measures as soon as possible on the 16th of March. So why did it take a further 7 days for the government to implement lockdown if SAGE was advising on the 16th of March? Can I start by putting on record my thanks to the City Council and all the health officials, particularly our Director of Public Health, Ivan Brown, for all the work they are doing to drive our infection rates down in Leicester. I welcome the extra testing capacity that we have received as a city, including the door-to-door testing, and I want to put on record my tribute to the people of Leicester, the city where I live, for their fortitude in doing all we can to drive this infection down now through 17 weeks of lockdown. If we still have to make further personal sacrifice to keep people safe and hunt this virus down with the lockdown, then so be it. But there is no question there will be a degree of dismay across the city in response to the Secretary of State's remarks. We welcome the opening of non-essential retail, but there are many businesses who were preparing to open their doors for the beginning of July who still cannot open their doors, and they will want to know whether they will get any specific extra business support. The Secretary of State suggested in the previous statement that they would. The business minister ruled it out. The continued lockdown coincides with the traditional Leicester fortnight. I don't know if the Secretary of State is familiar with the Leicester fortnight. It's the 2 weeks in July where our schools break up earlier than other schools across the country, and it's a time when many Leicester families will have booked holidays. But of course, they can't go on holiday because they're not allowed to, and many travel companies are refusing to pay them compensation and so on. So can he guarantee that they will not be out of pocket because they are not allowed to go on a holiday that they've saved up for all year round? Can the government step in, or can he force those travel companies to reimburse those Leicester families? As you know, Leicester is a city that suffers from high levels of child poverty, insecure work, low pay, lack of decent sick pay. We have many deep-rooted economic problems, and the spike in the city, or the larger outbreak in the city, appears to coincide with these inner-city areas where we know there's high levels of deprivation and overcrowded. We also know we have a large ethnic minority community, so can he explain why he's not yet implemented the recommendations of the Public Health England report into protecting those from minority ethnic backgrounds? And of course, there has been widespread speculation about the garment industry. Can he tell us how many HSE inspections and how many HMRC inspections have now taken place in Leicester's textiles factories, particularly since the Home Secretary a couple of weeks ago promised us she would stamp out any illegal exploitation. We note that he has rejected the advice of the City Mayor of Leicester to partially ease restrictions in parts of the city, although he's taken advice from the leader of Leicestershire County Council to ease restrictions in part of the county. Could he perhaps explain what the public health evidence is behind that decision? Because if the public health advice is to maintain, for example, the lockdown in the west of the city, when we know the infection rates are at the highest in the east of the city, why does that not advice also apply to the neighbourhoods that border the city boundaries? This is one greater urban area. So what is the public health reason why someone in one side of Gilmorton Avenue, I don't expect him to know Gilmorton Avenue in my constituency, but it illustrates the point. What is the public health reason why when someone living on one side of that avenue is now subject to restrictions because they fall under Leicester City Council, but they presumably are not allowed to cross the road now to speak to their neighbour who lives opposite them because they fall under Blaby District Council? There are other examples across the city as well. So if you could offer us that advice, I think we would appreciate it. Now, of course, Leicester went into lockdown because of the infection rate and because it took so long for us to get us the specific data. Local authorities are still complaining that they are not getting the patient-identifiable data, and they are not getting data on a daily basis, and they're not getting contact tracing data. The Prime Minister yesterday at Prime Minister's Questions said we have a world-leading system, the best system in the world with testing and tracing, and it will avoid a second spike this winter. But we know there have been problems with this testing and tracing throughout. Last week, it was revealed that he's been overstating the test numbers by 200,000. Sky News revealed that. Today, he's come to the House, and we're grateful for him updating the House about what's happening with Randox. I believe this is a £133 million contract that was given to Randox without any competitive tender. Could he just explain what is exactly wrong with these kits? How many of these presumably faulty kits have been used? Is there a health risk to anyone who has been tested with these kits? And how many, I'm putting themselves in a second position, there isn't a health risk. The government are withdrawing these kits. And how many people have these unsafe kits been used on? And why wasn't the certifications checked before these kits were used? These kits tend to be used in many care homes. We want care home residents to be tested regularly. We want care home staff to be tested regularly. Can he guarantee that those care homes will now get alternative kits rapidly? And just finally, today we've seen the broader testing, more testing data has come out today. The Prime Minister promised that tests would be delivered within 24 hours by the end of June. I think the figures today show only 66.9% of them are. On the tracing data, we see that only 71% of people are being contacted, not the 80% that we were promised. And isn't the truth that we've got swabs being recalled, we've got contact tracing the data not meeting the targets, we've got circle call centres with people not doing anything, and it's all costing 10 billion, and he's now bringing in Mackenzie's. Why is he throwing good money after bad? Why doesn't he invest in public health services, primary care, and local health teams instead to do this testing?
Mr. Speaker, the right-honourable gentleman has spent weeks complaining about capacity to do things like contact tracing, and now complains that we've got too much capacity. And I think he should decide on a position and stick to it. On the point on certification, on Randox and the kits that we put a pause on, the reason is that they had a CE stamp, and upon investigation of the certification of that stamp, the certification was not forthcoming, and therefore physical checks were done, and we found that the swabs weren't up to the standards that we expect. This is limited to the Randox element of the testing system, not the broader testing system that we have. And I explained the clinical position, which is that there is no evidence of any harm having been done, and that there is full access to testing because we have plenty of other test kits available. He asked about test and trace. 99% of the tests that are done, that need to be done quickly, are returned the next day. He asks about this more broadly about the comments of the chief scientific advisor to the Select Committee. Of course, the 16th of March is the day when I came to this House and said that all unnecessary social contact should cease. That is precisely when the lockdown was started, and so I'm glad that it's unusual to be attacked for saying exactly the same as the chief scientific advisor. On the questions with respect to Leicester, he rightly raises the Leicester fortnight, and schools have effectively risen for the summer in Leicester already. Of course, I would urge holiday companies that people in Leicester have booked with to reimburse people in Leicester who might have booked a holiday at this point. He mentions the problem and the challenges of insecure work in Leicester. He's absolutely right to do so. This is a very long-standing problem. I think we, across the whole House, would strongly support action to ensure that illegal, insecure work is stamped out. My colleague, my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, is taking action where that is appropriate. But of course, the public health response is vital. Finally, he asked about the public health advice on geography. Given that there were no cases in many areas of the county that are part of the conurbation of Leicester over the last week, it was, I think, a reasonable recommendation to me by the County Council to lift the lockdown in those areas. I gave the Mayor of Leicester the opportunity to put forward any changes he might have wanted to within the city boundary, but he declined to do so. And I think, based on public health across the whole city of Leicester, within the city geography, incidence of this disease is higher than a sustainable level, and we absolutely need to bring it down. And that's the basis on the advice and working with and listening to local leaders that we took the decision of the geography of the lockdown in Leicester. And I finally end again by paying tribute to people in Leicester who are enduring this lockdown longer than others. It is their fortitude that will help get their city safe again.
We're now heading to the Chair of the Select Committee is Jeremy Hunt. Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for special dispensation to ask this question remotely. I want to ask the Health Secretary about the worrying variation in coronavirus mortality rates between hospitals, which appear to range from 12.5% to 80%. Now, there may be some issues of deprivation or ethnicity, but some of that variation is likely to be a failure in some hospitals to adopt best practice, which is what the Getting It Right First Time programme led by Professor Tim Briggs does. So I wonder whether he would agree to meet me and Sir Tim to discuss whether the Getting It Right First Time programme could help reduce COVID mortality rates going forward.
Mr. Speaker, I'd be very happy to meet my right honourable friend and Professor Tim Briggs, who does an incredible job. He's a brilliant public servant who's done great work on the Getting It Right First Time programme. As my right honourable friend knows better than almost anybody, the unjustified variation in performance between different hospitals within the NHS is a huge issue across the board, because if the standards in every hospital were the same as the standards in the best hospital, the performance of the whole would be so much higher. That is exactly what the Getting It Right First Time programme was designed to deliver. It was instigated by my right honourable friend, and I'd be very happy to listen to what both he and Professor Briggs have got to say.
Let's head to Scotland and visit the SNP spokesperson, Dr. Philippa Whitford. Dr. Whitford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Directors of Public Health in England are still complaining they're not getting the information they need. They only started to get area data from late June, when it became clear that Leicester had had 900 cases in less than a month. Within a week, Leicester was back under lockdown. The Prime Minister has described this as his whack-a-mole approach to controlling COVID. But does the Secretary of State recognise that for the people of Leicester, this has felt just as bad as the national lockdown? I've raised many times the issue of test results from the UK government labs not being sent to GPs or local public health teams. Is it true that this was not even specified in the contract? Even after Leicester, and despite COVID being a notifiable disease since the 6th of March, local authorities and health protection teams in England are still only being sent anonymised area data, which is of little use to identify clusters. And it's only being sent on a weekly basis, which is far too slow. Does the Secretary of State not accept that public health teams need daily data with both work and home postcode details so they can spot an outbreak? And they need individual test results so they can isolate all those involved to break the chains of infection and prevent further spread of the virus. I know he rarely mentions isolation, but surely the Secretary of State knows it's actually isolation that breaks the chains of infection. But this should be the affected individuals, not a whole society or a whole city. The Test and Protect system in Scotland has been up and running since the end of May and was able to disrupt a cluster of just 12 cases in the south of Scotland. That's the level of detail required to drive an elimination strategy. He says local lockdowns will be the cornerstone of his ongoing strategy, but how does he plan to deal with the social and economic impacts? And will he not join the devolved and Irish governments in following an elimination strategy to avoid repeated local lockdowns? When does he envisage having a fully functioning test, trace, and isolate system in place across England?
Mr. Speaker, I'm terribly sorry. I'm not going to be able to answer all of the points that were made, but all I can say to the Honourable Lady is that I'll send her an update on the data that in England local directors of public health get, because there's been a huge amount of progress since many of the situations that he described. I bow to no one in my desire to use data to make policy and to get the best data out, and we've been getting better and better and better data out to local areas. We've been publishing more and more and more data, and many of the comments that she made were out of date. Richard.